Another one of the war incidents, we used to, of course, be worried about our husbands over in combat. And if we'd wake up in the middle of the night and couldn't get to sleep, why, we'd go and scratch on the screen of one of our friends. And this one night, the Dougherty's daughter-in-law and myself were over walking in the moonlight up Captiva. Not saying anything, just having our own silent thoughts. It was during the Battle of the Bulge where my Pete was. And her husband was a submarine man. And we looked out over the water, and not too terribly far offshore, here was a submarine surfacing. Well, I'm telling you, we got off the beach in a hurry. And I said, I think we should go down to the Coast Guard and report it. So we got in the car and took our precious gas and drove down. This was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and told the Coast Guard had to wake them up. And they thanked us very much, said there were no U.S. submarines in the area, and to please say nothing about it. And this was one of the mysteries that we kept bottled up amongst ourselves and never said a word. And of course we always wondered whether or not it was a German submarine, and it undoubtedly was. In all my ramblings I have said very little about Penny and Jay Darling, and where to begin to tell about these two marvelous, marvelous people. They stayed at Tween Waters Inn and were really the focus point as far as everybody was concerned. Very modest, attractive people. Penny was a little, very small lady and reminded you of a little bird, a happy little bird. And Jay, with all his interests, yet he, when you talked to him, you would think you were the only one in the world he was interested in. We got to know him very well. Our little Jimmy got to know him well first, because he was a tiny eater and never ate any dessert. And all he needed was for Jay to beckon his finger, and Jim was over there and would spend the rest of the meal with them and chatter in his own way. And Jay treated him as an adult, even though he was only 3 and 4 and 5. And then through him, then Jimmy would go over to their cottage with them, and they'd say they'd bring him home later. And he taught Jim his wonderful understanding and love of wildlife. And also Jay was extremely interested in the fact that our Jimmy had ESP with animals. When Jim was about 3, he would come in and tell me that he'd been out talking to Mrs. Blue Jay or Mrs. Woodpecker or Mr. Pelican and so on, and I just took it that it was child's language. And then one day he came in giggling and saying, "Oh, I just fooled Mr. Cardinal. Oh, he couldn't find me. I sat under a bush and he tried to find Mrs. Cardinal, but it was me all the time." And he told Jay about this, and Jay was extremely interested and told Dr. Ryan of the parapsychology department. When Jim was 4, he came in and said, "Do you see that cormorant out on the dock? I'm going to invite him into the house." And I said, "Don't be silly, Jim. You can't get within 50 yards of a cormorant." But in less than 5 minutes, he came in with a cormorant tucked under his arm, patting the cormorant's head and saying, "Don't be afraid. My mother wouldn't hurt you. She wouldn't hurt you for anything." And then he decided that the neighbors had never seen a cormorant up close. And he said, "I think I'll take him around and show him to everybody." Well, later on, when Jay heard about it, he was horrified. He said they go for human eyes, and he could scarcely believe it. So he started taking Jimmy on birding trips and was astonished because Jim could communicate with ESP, with birds. And they would come down from the trees. Jim would hold his hand out if it were a small bird, and the bird would come down and land on his hand. And he had this ability for years. It wasn't until he got to be a mixed-up adolescent that he lost it. But now that he's a grown man, he has regained it. And he is now in his mid-30s, and his home is surrounded by all kinds of wild animals that rush to meet him when they hear his car. He has baby flying squirrels and Florida mallards and northern mallards and, well, you name it, he has it. Penny and Jay love to play bridge, and I played bridge with them 3 or 4 nights a week. And we had good conversations along with these. And of course, Jay kept right up with all the news. He never missed a broadcast, night or day. And I can remember one morning about 6:15 when he came by and scratched on my screen and said, "I'm going to town. Do you want to go with me?" And I said, "I'd love to. Can you wait 5 minutes?" And I went in and asked Mother if she'd babysit for Jim. She said yes, of course, and I quickly got dressed and went over. And on the way down to the ferry, Jay outlined, he said, on the 6 o'clock news, he said, "I heard what that so-and-so Roosevelt's going to propose to do to Congress." And he said, "It's a pure waste of money of $3.5 million, and I'm going to stop it if I have to be on the phone all day." Which was very interesting sidelight. Well, we went over and said we would meet at the Bradford for lunch, and then Jay said, depending on my progress, why, we'll see whether we'll stay later. And when I got to the Bradford, there was Jay, all smiles. Well, he said, I got through to him all right, and I told him what was what. And he said he's going to drop the whole matter. Well, I had heard that J.N. Darling, Ding Darling, was the one man in the world that Roosevelt feared. He feared his pen. And it certainly was true in this instance. Anybody in need on either island, be they black or white or young or old, Jay seemed to know and find out and tend to it. And how many coats he's bought, and how many shirts and caps and socks and shoes for the indigent on the 2 islands, nobody will ever know. He was a very, very most beloved man. And he and my father, Dr. Beals, saw eye to eye, and what jolly times they had when they were together, and each agreeing with the other. As I've said, there are no words that could describe either Penny or Jay. They were just 2 very beloved, unique people. And another beloved person was Grace Price, owner and hostess of Tween Waters Inn. And Tween Waters was a most unique place where everybody just loved to go. Jay used to often say, it was the one place in the world where you met the most interesting people, from editors to owners of steel mills to authors to you name it, they were there. All one big family because of Grace Price bringing them all together. And he said, you paid fabulous prices, never had quite a big enough meal to satisfy you. You got yourself thoroughly lathered with soap, and the showers were sure to quit, and yet everybody loved it and nobody would miss coming back. Grace was just a lovely person and greeted everybody and would go from table to table making everybody feel welcome. And the food was just very delicious. Hardly a man's plateful, however. One night we had an interesting meal because Jim and I found that just dying porpoise on the shore. And everybody turned to Jay Darling when they didn't know what to do with them and things, so we went down there, and he brought a couple of the colored men along, and he said the porpoise had been killed by a depth charge. So they finished the porpoise off and carved steaks off of it. And that night for dinner we had, if you wanted it, fried chicken, or fried raccoon, or broiled porpoise. And I must say that I enjoyed the chicken the most of all. Another familiar sight on the island was the school bus. And the school bus lady would pick up laundry from people. She also always, every year, had a wash basket by the gears in the front of the bus, and in it was a new baby. And for about 8 years, every year there was a new baby in there, and everybody would flock out to see the latest new little Rhodes baby. One day when we were riding down in the car to Bailey's, there in the road was a great big long alligator who was highly incensed at us approaching. He reared up on his feet completely with his belly off the ground, and he bellowed his anger, and then he started down the road. Jim says, "Try and catch him, Mom." Well, I went 40 miles an hour, and you know that alligator, I never gained on him. And eventually he pulled off the road and into the underbrush where we couldn't see him. From then on, I really had great respect for alligators. The chapel by the sea soon became the focal point for a life on the island. It had originally been a little schoolhouse, and there were a group of people that were quite interested in it. One was Kay Schultz, his father, Mr. Alt, and Susan Carr, and Bud and Chet Loomis's father, Jim Loomis, and in an unofficial way, my mother. My mother's contribution to it was that, of course, those were the days of the ferry, that she would have the minister over to spend the night and give him breakfast and Sunday dinner. And the little chapel grew, and at first there were just a few chairs, and then they had to buy more chairs. And then came the ultimate time when they became prosperous enough that they thought that they could hire a minister, a retired minister, for the season. And then they became even more ambitious and thought, wouldn't it be lovely if we had pews? As the congregation grew older, and the chairs with them, the chairs became less and less comfortable. And so we acquired pews for in the chapel. And then Susan Carr and her husband built the altar that is in the front of the church, and their son helped build the archway behind the altar. Now, the women used to take turns, rather casually and informally, on flowers for Sunday. And one day, Debbie Bixby was sitting there, and as she came in earnestly praying and looked up, and there was the bare altar. And she thought, oh, who forgot to do the flowers this morning? And Debbie had on a new hat. This was in the era of the hats. And she had, it was a lovely spring one with flowers all around it. And the thought went through her mind, do I dare get up and put my hat on the altar for flowers? The altar looks so bare. Well, my mother never did tell me whether or not Debbie did put her hat out there or not. But she and Harold were greatly beloved people. And then Debbie's two sisters, Kat Whittemore and her husband, and dear darling Mary Purveer came down. And what a threesome the three of them were. As the years went by and my mother had gone to her heavenly home, Debbie became very, very forgetful. And she was the one that I knew the best. And I called her up one day when we first arrived and didn't realize she was forgetful, and asked her if she could come for lunch the next day. And she said she would love to. And I said, I'd like to invite Kat and your sister and Mary, too. And she said, well, Kat's right here. I'll ask her. And she said, Kat said she'd love to. And I said, well, will you ask Mary? And she said, yes, I'd be glad to. Mary at that time didn't have a phone. Well, the next day, Kat and Debbie came together, and we sat and we waited and waited. And finally I said, is Mary not coming? And Debbie put her hand over her mouth and said, oh, I forgot again. And I called up and Debbie's house, and the maid said she'd run over and tell Mary. And Mary said, well, my feelings, she came just as she was, bless her heart. And when she came, she said, well, my feelings were really hurt. I thought if she invited my two sisters, Why didn't she invite me? But we had a good laugh over it because my mother was so forgetful too. And many's the time she would forget what party she was going to, but one of her friends would stop by and take her, so then she knew she was at the right place. And as I said, she could laugh. So now when I'm very forgetful, I try and laugh as my mother did. And I imagine my children are telling tales just as I'm telling tales about my mother. It's fun to think back of the many, many pleasant things around the islands. One of them was Mrs. Strand, a dwarf who had a gift shop. Most of her things in her shop she made. And you maybe would purchase $1 or $2 worth of things, and out of her generous soul she'd give you $4 or $5 worth of things. You never could have come out having actually paid her money. And she was one of the kind people. And it was interesting to the children to see a real dwarf, and I'm sure she wore a wig because her hair was, in the 14 years I knew her, was always in the exact same state of disorder. And then Parker Mills one time had a restaurant with Signe Whiteman around the outside perimeter of the store. Parker ran the store, and then somebody said, Signe, why don't you have meals there? And, oh, it was quite a feather in your cap if you could reserve a table and have dinner there. At this time, Signe and Jimmy Whiteman had given up their Gulfview Inn, which was right on the Gulf. They were the parents of Carl Whiteman, and I've known Carl since he was a very kind little boy. Signe used to say pieces of bread for our Jimmy to feed the birds, and he never wanted to go up to the Gulfview Inn, which was at the end of Palm Avenue, until the school bus got there, because he wanted to see Carly, because Carly would be so nice to him. And that friendship began then, and now they're grown men, and Carl's first child, or his second child, his son, he asked our Jim to be the godfather, and when our son Jim was married, a very socially prominent girl in Savannah, why, he wanted Carl to be his best man, and he came and was best man. A trip to Mr. Kessen's island was one of the musts on the island. Mr. Kessen was one of the people that nobody knew too much about. He was a tall, lanky beachcomber. And the first time I saw him, he had on a tattered straw plantation hat, a tattered army shirt, tattered pants, and barefoot. And it was on the beach, and he called himself a beachcomber who lived off the land. And he also invited us to come and see him on his island. Well, we went one day, and you drove down the Wolfert Point Road a ways, and off to the right was a single-lane track, which you drove down, and when you got there, there was a bell that you rang that was on a post on a dilapidated dock that was just barely wide enough for one individual to teeter out on it as it wobbled. Mr. Kessen would come out on his wobbly dock over on his island and would paddle in a real Indian dugout. He would take 2 people at a time in the dugout, and that was an experience, because if you even sneezed, it rolled, as you know. The dugout was the burned out part of a huge tree. Well, when we got there, he would take us on the tour of his island, and a good deal of the trail we would had to crouch over. And there were Indian mounds on it, and there was an Indian fortification. And this was what he was most interested in. And at a crouch, you went around what he said was the encampment. Then he took us into what he called his museum. And in it he had large jars of pickled fish of all kinds and pickled octopus peering at you out of the glass jars. And he also had instruments that were made from shells. He believed the Calusa Indians used spoons, and he had conch shells with sticks in them, and he maintained this is where the word to conch somebody on the head came from. He also had some other very interesting artifacts. Amongst them were he had two crosses. One was the outside rim was silver and the inside was wood, and the other one was enamel. And the one that was of wood he sent to the Smithsonian, and they removed a small piece of the wood and tested it, and felt very sure that this was dated back to the time of when the Ponce de Leon and the other Spanish explorers were looking for the fountain of life. And he had a few Spanish coins that were there. And I know our Jim, who was 4 the first time we went over there, had the feeling that Mr. Kesson, what he really was living off was Spanish doubloons, and that he had found Gasparelli's treasure. Whether or not he had found it or not, I don't know. Then as you left his hut, there was a big glass jar, and in it was a sign saying, "This is for the kitty." And there was a picture of a sad-looking cat that Ding Darling had drawn for him. And you would return to the mainland once again in the dugout. And I can remember when we took a very elderly couple over, that they said that was one of the greatest adventures that they ever had had. Wouldn't have missed it for worlds. But I'm telling you, when you went prepared for the mosquitoes, because they were so thick that it was unbelievable. And you wore long pants and socks and long shirts and a jacket no matter how hot it was, and a bandana to cover your hair because the mosquitoes got caught in your hair and would bite your head. But Mr. Kesson was oblivious to all of this. And several years later, his place burned to the ground. People saw the flames and couldn't get over, and they believed that it was at night, and they believed that Mr. Kesson was in his shack when it burned to the ground. And that was the end of his tale. Another story about Mr. Futch, of whom I mentioned earlier. I don't believe I told you how he looked like a walking cadaver. He was an albino, and as albinos are, they have red-rimmed eyes, and around their noses are very red, and that is the only sign of any color. Well, he appeared at the mailboat dock one time in the summer, and Beulah Wiles tells the tale of how he came in and says, "Well, got the old lady in the boat." And she said, "Oh, you have? Isn't she coming up?" "Nope, can't move. Want you to fix her." So Beulah and T.M., her husband, went down to the dock, and sure enough, there was the old woman, deader than a doornail. And Beulah said, "What do you want us to do?" "Want you to fix her up, and I'll take her back," he says. So they did. T.M. got her out, and they took her in and did what was necessary, and Mr. Futch in the boat, and I guess it's the first time probably he ever had rowed the boat, took her back. And one supposes that he probably buried her, but I don't believe they ever found any headstone, and if he had put a cross up, by this time it would have completely disintegrated. There are many tales about Buck Key. When the mosquito control people were digging the ditch that went through Buck Key, they came on a mass grave of rather small people whom they believe have been the Calusa Indians. And the only thing that people speculate is that the white man must have brought some disease in that killed the whole colony, because there was no sign on the bones that they had met their death by having their heads battered in or anything of this sort. And there were many, many, many bodies in there, or rather many, 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 many bones. And I, with my own eyes, have seen these. I'm told that Matty Matheson has, with a machete, and he and his son Peter have made a very charming trail through the north part of Buck Key, and it's one of the things that I always thought would be fun to do next week, but somehow or other next week never came. And now, of course, I can't exactly go through with a walker, so I guess I'll just have to dream of what it's like in there. But we've gone through many times in the outboard through the canal, which winds and twists, and it's really, you feel as if you're on a complete adventure, and I recommend it highly to anybody. And there are many, many of the shorebirds that are very tame and eye you and move along stately ahead of you, but are never frightened. It really, in many ways, is fun to look back and think how things started. I can remember when we first came down, the back of Castaways was all thick, tangled jungle. Stella Mitchell owned really all this end at that time, owned all this end of Sanibel Island. And she gave a good deal of the property to her son. Dean had bulldozed, a road bulldozed down around almost to Dinkin's Bayou, and he called this Coconut Drive. And the first person to build down in that jungle was Susan Carr. Susan and Colonel Carr had a home up on Captiva, but they could see the erosion getting nearer and nearer. And she being a very smart woman, and he being an engineer, they, with the help of some of the natives, took their large house apart, brought it down here, and rebuilt it in this so-called jungle. And I can remember my mother saying, "What in the world does she want to live way off there in the jungle?" Well, when the road had been bulldozed, Stella Mitchell decided that it would be nice to make it more attractive. So she and Walker, her yard man, patiently over a period of many months planted a coconut and a casuarina Australian pine, and then a coconut. And all the way down they planted coconuts and pines. And now that's the way it is, all growing tall. And as I lie here and look across, here are 40 and 50-foot Australian pines, and I have watched them grow from seedlings. Of course, back then was when you knew everybody, and a car went by and you rushed out because you knew it was going to be a friend. And the changes that have come about, I try and close my eyes to it. I'll go into Bailey's, and I may see one or two faces. And it used to be an expedition to go, where you... Well, I hope I'm not duplicating what I already said before, but I don't think I had the recorder on. This is Betsy Steyaart, and I'm thinking back to the year 1940 and on up. When we, back in the good old days, as they say, we used to come over by the mailboat. One of the amusing things coming out from Fort Myers, the sign now that's in town and says God is love. When we reached there, we were in the country. So then everybody began jockeying for position to be sure and get on the next ferry, and tried to do it in a very ladylike manner. And you'd pass a car very carefully. The road was narrow. And then they would ease themselves past you until you rounded the corner and into Punta Rasa, and to see how many were in line, and you would quickly count and figure whether it was the big ferry that carried 11 cars or the little ferry that carried 9 cars. Then the next problem was that you didn't want to be the first car in line. So if you thought you were, you would hold back. And I can remember one time when my mother very carefully jockeyed herself around and triumphantly was the last one on the ferry when, much to her dismay, they turned the ferry boat around and she was in the front and heavy waves came sloshing over the end and all over her car. It was quite a feat to get down the ramp at low tide, if you could call it a ramp. It was scarcely wider than 3 feet on either side, and as you went down the boards, they clanked. And Captain Leon Crumpler, the ferry boat captain, would motion for you whether to turn to the right or keep to the left and position you on the ferry. And some of the people, particularly the females, were a little frightened to do this, so Captain Crumpler himself would put the car on the boat, and across the ferry we would come. And if it was rough, it would take us about 40 minutes to come. And if it was calm and didn't have to be afraid of the waves, why, we would make it in a shorter time. One Christmas, Alice O'Brien, who was one of the notables up on Captiva, hired Captain Leon on Christmas morning to take her mother to early morning mass on Christmas Day. So she and her mother set out in their majestic Rolls Royce, complete with chauffeur, and got on the special ferry. Well, in came a heavy fog, and with a swish halfway over, up onto a sandbar went the ferry boat. And it just so happened that this particular Christmas day was a day when there was only one tide. The tide was low. So they waited and spent Christmas Day on the ferry boat with Captain Leon until the high tide came in that evening. They really took quite a ribbing on their Merry, Merry Christmas, sitting out on one of the sandbars. Then the mail boat. This was one of the events of the day. You wrote your letters in the evening and in the morning and went up to meet the mail boat. You got there early enough for your letters to get into the post office, where Beulah Wiles and her mother postmarked them and got them in the mail bags. Then came the mail boat with the 2 Captain Singleton brothers. They brought over milk daily. They brought over your groceries and any other odds and ends of errands that you might have. You pay them a small sum, and they would get anything from shoelaces to a bottle of bourbon. So it was really one of the events of the day. Then everybody would wait, because this was a time of gas rationing. Everybody would wait and chat and make their social dates for the evening and wait for the mail to be distributed. And then everybody would wait around and hear what we war wives heard from our husbands. And I can remember one day when I had a letter from Pete, and there's a whole bunch of photos in it. And of course, the one person in the photograph that I was interested in was Pete. And Ding Darling, who had never seen Pete before, was really very interested. And I said, I don't know who these other guys are with him. He started to laugh, because the only one that was important to me was Pete. And the other guys happened to be General Bradley, who had in one of them Pete's arm, and General Eisenhower when he was listening to Pete, and General Montgomery and Air Marshal Tedder. And he was very amused that the only person that was important to me was my darling Pete. Coming early were 2 dear ladies that were there, and in all the years that I knew them, they were always sitting in the chairs out in front of the post office. One was Mrs. Ferrum, and she wore a large, wide-brimmed hat, and she was short and rather plump, and had rather a caustic wit. And the other was Miss Trula Rouse, who was truly a southern gentlewoman to the nth degree, and she always wore a black hat that had red plastic cherries on the front of it. And they were part of the institution. And another daily thing that we watched out for was the sight of a rowboat coming across from Buck Key. Rowing a boat was an Indian woman, and sitting in the back with his arms folded and a broad-brimmed black hat, and in cold weather a lady's coat with a large fox fur collar, and his arms folded majestically, were the Futches. Probably everyone will have a different version of the hurricane, which I can't remember whether it was in 42 or 43. But I have to put in my 2 cents about it. Of course, I heard about it over TV and radio and waited patiently to hear from my parents to know whether or not they'd been swept to sea. Then I finally got a letter from my mother and one from my father. And I read my mother's first, 20 pages, describing it all. It was her first hurricane that she went through. And the worst part came at night, and the house she rented, which no longer exists, but was near Stella Mitchell's. She would talk about how the wind shrieked like a million banshees, and the trees were crashing all around her, and the house was surrounded by water, and she could hear it lapping against the sides of the house. And she interspersed her paragraphs in, "I've been in to look at your father, and I'm so mad at him, he must have taken a sleeping pill. And he slept all through the hurricane." Well, when Mother woke up in the morning, the house was still surrounded by water, and about 15 palm trees over on their sides and Australian pines on their sides. And, as I said, great excitement. Then I came down and heard of the various things that had happened. And these were the funny things. One was Captain Smith, who lived up near Tween Waters. And Captain Smith, for 3 years, had been on the point of dying, and I had gone rushing up with my father driving. My father was Dr. Beals, who did Good Samaritan work on the islands, because word would come that Captain Smith had died. Well, by the time we'd get there, he had a pulse and he had a blood pressure, and he would pull out of it. But in the middle of the hurricane, he took it upon him to enter his heavenly home. They got word to Max and Jean Hayford, and Max came down and measured Captain Smith and hunted up, and with a couple of the colored men, and I don't remember who else, found enough pieces of lumber to make a casket for Captain Smith. And they brought it in and suggested to Mrs. Smith that she should go in the living room while they fixed Captain Smith up. Well, Mrs. Smith asked them to wait because she just couldn't bear to have the captain put in that box. And she said, "I have a new comforter that I just made." And so she gave it to Max and went in the other room. Well, they put the comforter in the box that they had made for Captain Smith. But then Captain Smith didn't fit in. So they didn't want her to know about it. They took the comforter out and put it out in the bushes where they could pick it up afterwards. And they got Captain Smith in, and they nailed the lid down and then told her that they were ready. When they put the comforter in, Captain Smith wouldn't fit. So they removed the quilt and put Captain Smith in and nailed down the cover and hid the quilt so Mrs. Smith wouldn't know, and that they could take care of it and hide it. And then they called Mrs. Smith in, and she said, "Oh, I did hope I could see him." And they said, "Oh, well, now it was all nailed down. They didn't know where they could get more nails." And I thought this was very sweet of them. Then down the island went Maxton, checking on the people that went down, and he came to Belton Johnson's house. Well, Belton's house was not only hit by the hurricane, but in the middle of the hurricane was a twister. and it took the house up and twisted it and took it off its foundations and set it down. Well, Belton's mother-in-law, Miriam's elderly mother, was visiting. And as most elderly people have the inclination when there's a disaster impending or they're going to take a trip, they're very, very afraid that they'll have trouble with their elimination. So what they love to do, my mother included, was to take a dose of salts. Well, the twister came and Grandma was sitting on the throne, and when the twister came, Grandma, off the throne she went, but Epsom salts continued to work. So Max, bless his heart, he and Belton got Grandma fixed up again when the salts took care of her, and on Belton went. He went on up the island, and Max went. He went up the island to see how the Rumseys were. Mr. Rumsey was a builder, a very, very fine master builder on the island. He built the old Loomis house. It now belongs to the Wilseys. It's the beautiful home just beyond Belton Johnson's. Well, she handled all the money, and as they said, she could squeeze a nickel and get a quarter out of it. And as their house became surrounded by the water, she said to him, "Now, Bill," she said, "there's no sense in all this food going to waste. We're going to be swept out into the Gulf, so come on, sit down. We're going to eat everything we have here." And even though he protested, they sat down and they plowed through all the food they had. Well, the next day, much to their absolute amazement, the house still stood. As I said, he was a master builder, and there it was. But there was about 10 feet of water around them. And Max, when he saw that they were there, they waved to him frantically because, this being the next day, they were hungry for food. Well, they had to wait 3 days before they were rescued because Max, knowing that they were all right, there were other people in dire circumstances. And also there were Australian pines all over the Captiva Road, and those had to be sawed through so cars could get through. And the Captiva Road, as it approached the little wooden bridge, had about 4 feet deep of soft sand. Well, you can imagine what this was. You came gunning down the road, lickety-split, as fast as you could in order to get through the sand and up onto the bridge. Well, the islanders knew this, but strangers didn't. And, of course, when cars finally were able to come over, everybody wanted to see the damage that had been done, and they would come over the bridge. Well, they had to back down because you couldn't back through the sand. I had quite an altercation one evening with a gentleman who refused to back down. I refused to back into the sand because I knew what would happen. In exasperation, I told him I'd drive his car backwards if he didn't know how to back, and that really tore it. So I got in the car and locked all the windows. And I said, "I will back down and leave my inside tires in the rut, and you can go ahead." Well, he came across very cautiously and, of course, immediately got bogged down in the sand. And I, having had a little experience in the sand here, eased myself up onto the bridge and went on home. And all during the night I could hear him grinding his way down deeper and deeper and deeper into the sand, and he became eventually so stuck that he had to wait several days before a tow truck could come to get him. Another thing the hurricane did was took out the ferry docks on both sides. And on the 4th day, the mailboat was able to come and able to, T.M. Wiles had repaired the mailboat dock enough so it could stop. Now, this all happened shortly before Christmas, and my mother, being very sentimental, as I am about Christmas, was very concerned about her Christmas list. So she made out a list with a few suggestions for people and gave it to Captain Singleton to do her Christmas shopping for her. Which he did, and he did a stupendous job. Our family had beautiful gifts, and the gifts that she gave to people on the island. Stella Mitchell had the sofa pillows for 20 years later. The Captain Singletons were lifesavers indeed to many people. Well, my little Jimmy, age 4, and I came on down and to see all the havoc. And the first thing we noticed is the minute we got off the ferry, my mother had us wind up all the windows because the mosquitoes descended. And believe it or not, one had to run your windshield wipers in order to see out because the whole car was covered with mosquitoes. And we drove around, and bathtubs and washstands were 2 and 3 miles away from sitting in the sawgrass, 2 and 3 miles away from Cassia Belle. There was very little of Cassia Belle left. And we came on up the island, and the 15 palm trees that Mother had written were down, and I was heartsick because I loved them. They were in our side yard. There they were, tall and stately and majestic and growing. And I said to Mother, I thought that you said they were all over on their sides. And she said, oh, they were, but they bought over block and tackle, and they pulled them up and staked them up and look at them. This was a new concept to we Northerners, that this is the way you could treat trees. And some of the trees, of course, were at various angles because the block and tackle didn't get them all up straight. It was during this 3-week period when you couldn't go to town because there was no ferry dock that the wives began cutting their husbands' hair. And it was fun to watch up at the mailboat to see the various haircuts. I remember my mother had me tackle my father's. Well, he was practically scalped. I'd do one side and then I'd look at him, and that was higher than the other side, so I would try and even it up. And he went to a neighbor to have his hair cut the next time because he had just a few little wisps on the top of his head. I'd like to talk a little bit about my mother and father because they were real characters of the island. My dad, who was a physician, retired early because he had had 2 strokes. But on the island he did Good Samaritan work. And he saw at least 5 or 6 patients a day, and he did everything. There was everything from cut hands and cut legs and cut feet to serious illnesses, and to several people who had cancer and needed their dressings changed every day and needed the shots at night, to broken limbs. And Mother said she never knew when she came back in the living room what she'd find. He also loved fishing. He and Grandpa Dean, Stella Mitchell's father, and Dean Mitchell's grandfather, were great fishermen on the bridge. And the 2 of them, along with Vern Simmons, who built the house up on Pelican Point where the Kesslers now live, fished all day long and had marvelous luck. And my dad particularly didn't believe in catching any fish unless it was for food. So he always had 2 bushel baskets out there. And as people drove by on the bridge, he'd offer them fish. And the colored people that worked up on the island always looked forward to picking up their part of their dinner because Dr. Beals would be on the bridge handing out fish. He was very greatly beloved because it didn't matter what time of the day or night that somebody was in trouble that my dad didn't go to their rescue. And when I came down to stay with my parents for the 2.5 years that Pete was in combat, why, I would drive Daddy. My mother, as she got a bit older, became very forgetful, but very happy about it and giggled about her forgetfulness. And I can remember one time when I was up north, she called me up and said, I'm going to have a party after church on Sunday. And I said, great, how many are you having? And she said, 14. And I said, who are you having? And there was silence. And so I waited, and I said, Mother, are you still there? Because most of the time your phone connections were broken off. And she said, yes, I'm still here. And I said, who are you having? And she giggled and she said, I haven't the foggiest idea. I can't remember who I invited. And I said, well, what are you going to do? And she said, well, right after church, I'll go down to the Nutmeg House and I'll wait. And when there are 14 there, then I'll know everybody's come. And then another time, she had a dinner party here at home. And she seated everybody in their proper places and sat down and picked up her shrimp fork and proceeded to talk. And then Tom Fraser picked up shrimp and he looked at Mother and he said, Elizabeth, and Mother stopped her conversation and said yes, and he said, you forgot to cook the shrimp, which of course was a hilarious thing, and my mother laughed at it just as much as anybody else. Then another thing that she loved was new cars, and most every year she got a new one, and she got a purple car one year. And she decided that she wanted to have her clothes match, so she got from the car dealer a strip of the color of the paint, and she sent it down to New York to Bess and said she wanted a suit made that color and a hat made that color and gloves that color. And sure enough, it came in due time, matching her purple car. My mother was also inclined to drive much too fast, which worried us and everybody else. And Admiral Conrad and all other people used to call her the Purple Flash. One day he asked Admiral Conrad, Ed Conrad, asked her, he said, Elizabeth, why do you drive down the middle of the road? And her response was, well, how can I tell where the road is if I don't drive over that middle line? Kate and I, of course, were very upset at her driving, but she would have nothing to do, but she would drive. Another tale about her driving was this. I had begun flying down and driving Mother north and then reversing the process when she came back down. And she called up and decided she wanted to come north and wanted to leave in 2 days. And I said, Mother, I can't do it. And I was very involved with school board business in New York State on the local level and on the state level. And I couldn't because I had to be in Albany. And we got a telegram, don't worry, darlings, I'm on my way. Helen Eager is helping me drive. Well, at this point, Helen Eager had lost the sight in one eye, so here was my mother that could see very little. She used to say, don't worry. When I get near enough, I can tell whether it's a bush or a car on the road. So the two of them started off. Well, needless to say, many prayers went up that they'd have a safe time. And they arrived in due time in Lyons in time for dinner that night. They took 4 or 5 days to come up. And during the dinner conversation, Mother said, we never had a close call the whole time, did we, Helen? And Mrs. Eager responded, no, we didn't, Elizabeth. And Jimmy, from his mature 15-year-old, said, well, you wouldn't have seen it if there had been one. And my mother gave him such a hurt expression and saying, now that was not a kind remark. Well, dinner progressed on, and Mother said, oh, they have the nicest state troopers in Pennsylvania. So I said, well, what were they? How did you find that out, Mother? And she said, well, we were on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And quickly I said, well, that goes east and west. And Mother said, oh, I know, that was the whole problem. We knew we should be going north. So she said, after we got on it, I said to Helen, well, we'll just back up the road and get off. And she said, these 2 nice troopers came along. And I ran off, said, oh, we know we shouldn't be doing this, but we've gone past our exit. And she said they stopped all the traffic in both directions and had us cross the mall, and we got off the turnpike just as nicely as anything. And I said, how much did that cost you? Oh, she said, not a thing. He just asked us not to drive on the turnpike anymore. I guess he just was glad to get rid of her. There were quite a few people on the island at that time that had no business driving. One of them was darling Mrs. Ewing, who at age 89 was still driving her car. I guess she was 88. And when people saw her coming, they got right off the road. Mrs. Ewing is Bumpy Stevenson's aunt and a perfectly delightful, charming person. But what stopped her finally from driving as she came across the Captiva Bridge, she didn't quite make it, but fortunately, instead of going into the blind pass, she hit the abutment, and that stopped her. It stopped her and stopped the car and stopped her driving. During the war years, one of the big events we had on the island was a Red Cross auction. I was asked by the head chapter chairman in Lee County, would I do it for Captiva Island? And at first I said, oh heavens, I don't know how to do anything like that. And then with a husband in combat and my best friends on the island, their husbands in combat, I said, sure, we'll do it. So Jean Loomis and her sister Sue Lyon and I got together and said, let's have an auction, which we did. And then we got the idea that we would see if every single person on the island would make something for the auction, even the little folks. Teddy Loomis, who was 3, and our Jimmy, who was 4, made shell jewelry, which they auctioned off at some very handsome prices, much to the children's delight. And everybody made something. And one of the colored men made his choice mosquito whiskers. And these were like brooms, only very, very flexible. And he made them out of shredded palm fronds. And really, it was impossible to walk or move outside without a whisker. And you'd whirl those around and brush the mosquitoes off of you, because they came in swarms. And had George Campbell been on the island in those days, he wouldn't be against this mosquito control. If you opened your mouth, you got a mouthful of mosquitoes, unless the wind was blowing. Anyways, we had this auction and had promises from people, and we had 2 artists that painted pictures, and we raffled those off. And we had the auction in the patio at the Loomis house. And we had one of the men made a cross out of chicken wire, and early in the morning we girls that were on the island gathered up bushel basketfuls of red hibiscus and made a red hibiscus cross, which we pinned to this double sheet. So it was really quite stunning. And Al O'Brien, who I spoke of before and was such a marvelous person and a real character, volunteered to be the auctioneer. Well, she was an auctioneer beyond all auctioneers. When I can remember 3 items that came up for auction. Signe Whiteman's homemade bread that everybody just thought it was out of this world. And the first one that came up for bid, Ding Darling and Mr. Hutchinson, who was president of Bethlehem Steel Company, began bidding against each other for this loaf of bread that Signe had made. And it went up eventually to $37. Well, the people at Tween Waters Inn had an idea how much they wanted to contribute to the Red Cross Fund, and so they just had fun bidding up on things. So Al put Signe's second loaf up and said, now this one is even more luscious than the others. She said, what am I bid? Well, the bidding became very brisk, and that one went up for $35. And her third loaf of bread sold for $35. And to see Signe's joy and utter amazement to think that her bread went for that price. And that night at dinner, the pieces were sliced very thin, and everybody had a piece of this pure gold Signe bread. To make a long story short, when the money was all counted, and I went down to the Coast Guard station that had the only means of communicating with the mainland, and they radioed over for me to the chairman how much we had made, and they had to repeat it 3 times, because at our auction and because of the generosity of people in making things and the generosity of the people buying things, We overpassed the quota for all of Lee County that year. Jean Loomis and her little Teddy, who was 2 when she first came, and her sister Sue, who was not married, Sue Lyon, and Jimmy, who was 3 then, and I used to go down.